Hello guys, today we're going to be talking about the difference between parenting, grouping and constraints. So all three describe ways of creating groups and organising content into hierarchical structures. But they have some slight differences between them, particularly the constraints thing, which in actual fact I'm not going to be talking about too deeply today. So what we have here is a scene. This is the living room from the Home 1 set, which I will just show you over here, if I can find it. Let me have a look. So here's the Home 1 set, and it comes with various rooms. Here I have the living room loaded, and then I've added to it the couch scene and the hi-fi scene, which this is a hi-fi scene here, and these here are the couches, and I've got a wall at the front which is missing. I'll just quickly show you here. I'll just rotate around this scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this table here, and I have orbit selected, switched on, which means that the table now forms the center of rotation as I move the camera around. And you'll see there's no wall at the back. I've hidden it. And if I expand here the living room scene by holding Alt down and clicking on this arrow here, we can see all the parts of this scene here, and I believe it's the front wall that I've hidden. Let me just rotate back around so we can see when I make it visible. So the front wall, there you go, there's the front wall. So I've made that invisible so that we can see into the scene. But what parenting does, it essentially gives you a hierarchical structure, which you can see here. This is the hierarchy window, which you can add to your scene or make visible by clicking on the window menu and clicking hierarchy editor. I've docked it here so that it's easier to see what's going on. And you can see here the living room scene has three components. We have the living room building here, we have the sofa seat here, and the couches, and then we have the hi-fi and all of the clutter that's on the hi-fi. So they load in three separate parts, and each of the three is a separate parented group. So if I just open the living room, which is the basic walls and ceiling and stuff, you can see here he's got the back windows, the wall sockets, the left walls, all of the different components here, and then they're all organized into hierarchies underneath this group container called the living room. So living room itself is not actually an object, it's a container, and then below that we have another container called body, and then we have actual things such as back wall, back windows. So he's organised them, blinds, he's organised them so that they can be turned on and off conveniently. Now, whenever you create a household scene, it's much more convenient if every single component of that scene can be made visible or invisible, moved around individually. But what that does do, you can see just for this living room here, we've got probably 20 different separate parts here, maybe even more, and that's an awful lot of components to manage. But if we hide them all into, we parent them all into this group called living room, now look how much easier that is to organize within your hierarchy window. Hierarchy is an invaluable tool for navigating your scenes. So if I now have a single container called living room, anything that I apply to that container applies to all of the components below. I say anything, any movements, any translations or rotations. I'll show you what I mean. So if I scale that living room, all of the subcomponents or the children of that parent group also get scaled at the same time. If I rotate that, they all rotate together. So it's a great way of organising things into hierarchies that can be manipulated simultaneously. And when I open this up, you'll see that there are, beneath the living room group, there's the body group. Then beneath the body group, there's the back wall group. and that these can all be closed down into subgroups. So back wall, for example, I might want to hide everything on the back wall, and there's the back walls all become invisible. And so these subcomponents are called children. So here the back window 1L is a child of the back wall, or the back wall is a parent of the back window. Then the body is the parent of the back wall, and the living room is the parent of the back wall as well. So in a sense, you could consider these to be children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We don't generally call it that. We just generally consider them each to be children of the level above, or parents of the level below. So this is one situation where it's very, very useful to be able to organise things into coherent hierarchy. So here we have the living room. As I demonstrated, when I move the living room around here, this just moves the building. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, whenever you load new figures into a scene, they automatically come in at the 0, 0 point unless they've been saved at some other point. By which I mean, if I load a new figure, like a new character, Michael or Victoria or La Femme or whatever, they will come in at 0, 0, 0 in the X, Y and Z. But often, let me just show you this home one. If I added, say, the bedroom here, the bedroom would load in at a point maybe over here or forwards here, which is not 0, 0. So it's very useful to be able to move entire rooms around simultaneously. So here, if I want to move this living room, that's fine, but this furniture here will stay where it was. So what I could do is I could just drag this into here in the hierarchy window, or I could choose hi-fi unit up here, and I can then do object and then change parent, and then change the thing that is that's going to be its parent to living room, and you'll see that jumps inside here. And now I go down to the body level, and you'll see here that I've got suite and hi-fi unit. I don't know why that made that the child of the body rather than the child of the living room, but that often happens. Also, it's worth noting that when you're moving things around in the hierarchy window, only things which turn blue when you drag, you can only create a parent-child relationship of things that turn blue. So sometimes you'll find that you'll have a figure such as here Victoria 4, which is not visible in the scene at the moment, and you can't parent to the root level. You can't child to the root level. You can only child to the body or some component below it. That's just a useful way of knowing what you can create this child relationship with. So by adding these now to the living room group, now when I move the living room group, all of those subcomponents also move. Also, when I scale them, they all scale or rotate or become visible or invisible together. Now there is one important thing one difference between parenting and grouping. I've not talked about grouping yet, but with the living room group, remember I have this front wall invisible. There's also a ceiling here which is invisible. Watch what happens. Look, if I change the visibility here so these eyes in the hierarchy window denote visibility. They're the equivalent of going here into the properties tab and clicking visible or invisible. But if I do it here in the hierarchy window, every child of the parent also becomes invisible. But, and this is a really important thing to notice, when I now make that visible, every child, including the ones that were invisible, now become visible. And by that I mean the roof and stuff that was previously set to invisible has now become visible as well. I'm just going to undo that just to show you the difference. So here, look, if I go into the living room, you can see that some of these are set to invisible, but the parent visibility toggle overrides these. Now if these were in a grouping instead of, I'll demonstrate. So let me take suites. No, I'll just create a grouping here. So I'll just do object and I'll just create grouping. And we've created a grouping which is, okay, I don't know where that grouping's gone. Right, there's just one grouping. So what happened was I forgot that groupings don't show up by default in the hierarchy window. So there's my grouping. So now if I drag my living room group into that grouping 1, and now I change the visibility of the grouping, now when I turn it back on, it doesn't override the toggled state of the visibility of the sub-objects within the grouping. So in many ways it's better off to use a grouping than it is to use a parent, even though a parent and child creates a more intuitive organization of content. Actually using a grouping protects the visibility state of sub-objects within the grouping. See here, front wall and floor and ceiling still are toggled to invisible. If I go up here into the properties, you can see they're set to visible to not visible here, and I can toggle the visibility state of the entire group and they retain that state. Now let's talk about another situation where parenting is useful. I'm just going to change to a camera that I created earlier, and that is this figure here. So what I have here is a Victoria figure, and she's wearing clothes, obviously. So the clothes are conformed to her. So when I bring the clothing into the scene, I then choose conform. With the clothing selected, I do conform to, and then I choose Victoria. Or, since I think pose a 9 or something like that, I can just drag clothes straight from the content library and drop them on her figure, and they will conform that way. They'll auto conform without having to do that extra step. Now I want you to see something, and this is my pain in the butt. So I've got Victoria selected here. In the parameters tab here, if I scale her, her clothes don't scale with her. But this is a little trick for you. If I now select her clothing, I'll just do her tunic, and now parent her tunic to her, so figure. Oh, incidentally, before I do that, Poser recognises figures and objects. So object here, there's a change parent option. Figure here, there's a set figure parent option. Not even the same language actually. And I've never yet been able to figure out what the difference is between figure parenting and object parenting. They both do exactly the same thing. In the hierarchy menu, I could just drag here. So if I take her tunic and just drag it onto her body, it's not changed there, but her tunic is now a child of her body. If I open that up, there's her tunic, and look what happens now. In fact, you can also group do that. If I grab them both here with shift, drag to there, and now if I take her body and scale it here, her clothes scale with her. So for those of you who like to have clothed figures in your content library, perhaps you're saving them to your character library, and then perhaps you have figures that you use often, say a medieval character or a futuristic character that's fully clothed, but sometimes you change the scale of them. It might be a good idea to parent the clothes to them as well. It's one less stage you have to do when you scale. Okay, so I'm just going to show you another common situation where parenting is needed with figures. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a sword here. So what I have here is a Templar sword. When I load it to the scene, and it's saved auto-parented. I've already talked about auto-parenting when you save props in another video. But what this has done this sword has now loaded as a child of this hand. Now I'm going to actually unparent that. So this, if I open Victoria here, so we can see the full hierarchy. Now I'm going to close all of this unnecessary stuff, and I've got these annoying things are groupings. If you switch off the visibility here, sorry, not groupings, deformers. If I switch those off now, it simplifies my view. So I have right collar down to right hand, and you'll see here down here, although the name is really stupid, this Merlin, whatever it is a Templar sword. So I'll just show you by making it invisible. If I change the visibility here, reparent selected to, and if I select universe, that now is no longer parented to her hand. So when it's unparented, I can move it in the Y, I can move it in the X, and what it's doing, it's moving in what's known as global or world space. So if you imagine that there's a coordinate system where X is across, Z is backwards and forwards in the scene, and Y is up and down, this sword is moving in that space, in that coordinate space. Now, that's fine, and I think of things in those terms, but there are times when you don't want that. So if I grab that sword, in fact I'm just going to undo it so as it reparents to her hand. So where's her hand? Right hand here, right hand here. So I'm going to undo so it just reparents here. So now, again, if I do Y, it moves up and down. X, it moves left and right. But this sword is now a child of this hand. So look, if I choose this shoulder here, and now I move the shoulder up and down, so I move the shoulder down to her side. But now look what happens if I move this sword. So you might have thought that if I do up and down, it will continue to move up and down, X and Y here. X and Y. But look, up is relative to the hand orientation. So now that's moving more in an X direction, and X is going to move what we thought was up and down before. So that is what's known as object space. So this child has now inherited the coordinate system of the orientation of this arm, and that can be quite confusing. I wish that you could override that sometimes without losing the parenting, but it is what it is. I guess there are lots of times when you want it to move in relative space. A relative space is another way of describing object space. If I parented to this ball is an object, this is a figure. So this is relative to the thing that you've parented to, which at times can be useful, other times can be a pain in the butt, to be honest. Okay, so here's another situation where you might want to use parenting, and this is very, very common. I'm just going to go into my props library, and I'm going to go into my clothes and accessories. Okay, now to do this, I'm going to have to reset this figure to 0 position, because otherwise it's going to make things awkward. So I'm just going to choose her. I'm just going to choose her body, and I'm going to reset that to 0. And you'll see there that the sword moved with her. And now I'm going to move back to my other camera here. So she's in 0. And I'm just going to hide this other grouping, which here. I'm just going to hide that grouping that I created there. The reason that I've moved her to 0, 0 is that clothing, props and almost everything loads into the scene at a coordinate position of 0, 0. So if I choose her, you'll see here that her position or her translation within the scene is 0, 0 and 0. So Z is backwards, X is across and Y is up and down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load a cap into the scene. Let me just find a clothing prop, and I'm just going to load a baseball cap. And the baseball cap has jumped onto her head here, but it's not parented to her head. So if I change to the face cam here, this will frame her head here. An alternate way of doing that, if I just go back to that other camera, so this is auxiliary camera 2. An alternate way of doing that would have been to choose her head and then do frame selected. And I find that that's a little bit further, I'm gesturing my hands again, that's a little bit further away than a face cam, so each achieves the same thing, but this frame selected within the current camera. So if the current camera was set to frame your scene, this has now ruined your framing. So if I go back to where I was, if I do face cam, now the face cam is a separate camera, so when I go back to my auxiliary camera 2, that will still be in the framing that it was. But you can see here the cap here. I'm just going to move this baseball cap down onto her head, kind of. Oh, I could mess about scaling it, but it doesn't matter. So I'm going to select her head, and now look, if I bend her head, the baseball cap just stays hovering above. But if I now parent this, so I'll open her up, collapse these down, don't need all of these. Okay, it's opened up all of the clothes as well. It would have been easier just to just open one level there. See this cap at the bottom? If I drag it up onto her head, it's now the child of the head. So you can see it's one level indented. That shows that it's the child of the parent that's one level further out. So there's the hierarchy being demonstrated. So this cap now is the child of this head. And now if I move the head, so I select the head in the hierarchy window, or I could have clicked on it here, or I could have gone up here with Victoria selected and chosen body part head here. You use whichever is more convenient. Now when I bend her head, or twist it, or whatever I want to do, that cap now, oops, it wasn't perfectly positioned in the Z position. So I'll just select the hat, move that back, and now that works in both axes, and you'll see that that cap now moves properly with her head. So it's just a nice way of creating a parent-child relationship where props attached to figures move with the figures as opposed to you having to move them separately afterwards. Okay, it's also very common to do that with hair. Incidentally, I could save this hat as a hair object. If I went into the hair library, I could save that cap as if it was hair. Now I'm just going to show you one other nice little trick that one of my followers taught me. In Daz Studio, it has a fantastic lighting feature called a headlamp, and what a headlamp means is that whatever camera you're viewing through has an artificial lamp which illuminates the scene from that camera's perspective. And so even when you're working with very dark scenes, the headlamp enables you to see, and then when you render, the headlamp switches off if you have it configured to do so, and the scene just renders with whatever lighting you set up. But the headlamp basically means that you can always see what you're doing. So let me just go back out to my main camera, and I'm going to bring that other group back in as well. Okay, so here's the scene. Now you can't see at the moment, but if I turn on lights and cameras visible in the hierarchy window, I have two here which I created earlier. I have a headlamp, which is here, and I have a headlamp cam. Now usually when you create a camera, they're not visible, but what I did was I selected the camera, and then I went up to display, and I chose object style smooth shaded, and that made the camera visible. I also did the same with the light. This is a spotlight, and at the moment they're configured so that the spotlight points forwards just above the camera. And now all you need to do is drag the headlamp so that it becomes the child of the headlamp cam. And now watch, whenever I move this camera, so I'm going to move it forwards in the scene, the lamp moves with it. So I'll just turn this spotlight on. It's not switched on at the moment. turn it on, and you can see here now it's projecting into the scene. An important thing you need to be aware of, so this is called headlamp cam. If you view from that position, so I right click there above main cam, right clicked above main camera, chose camera view, and then went to headlamp cam. If you view from that camera, you see the light gets left behind, but as soon as you let go of the movement tools here, the lamp catches up to the camera. So it's just a great way. See here now, wherever I move, I have that spotlight shining onto the scene, and it's just a kind of a trick way of letting your scene be illuminated. So thank you very much to the follower who gave me. I'm really sorry that I didn't look up your name before I did this. Okay, so I'm just going to make that grouping invisible. One more situation where you might want to use parenting here is for adding eyebrows as well. You can do that instead of hair. You can also do, let me add a sphere to the scene, although it doesn't need to be a sphere, but just for the sake of this it will be easy to see. So I'm just going to go into primitives, load sphere. There you go, there's the sphere. You can also have, and I think I already touched upon this, but you can also have a sub-parent. So this sword is a parent, excuse me, is a parent of Victoria. This cap is a child of Victoria, sorry. This cap is a child of Victoria. So a single figure can have multiple children, but you can't have multiple parents for a single figure. So Victoria here can now be a child of this ball. So now where I move the ball, Victoria goes, and her child relationship with the sword, her parent relationship with this sword is still maintained. So that is still, the sword is a child of Victoria's arm, the clothing is a child of Victoria's body, Victoria is a child of this sphere. So we have a nested hierarchy, if you like that. But as I say, you can't have multiple parents of a single object. But, and this brings us on, so I'll just undo that. This brings us on to constraint groups. Now, I'm not going to get to demonstrate this now because it's an animation feature and it would be too complicated to set up a scene for what is basically a short tutorial on parenting. But a constraint group, which you configured up here. So I do object group and add constraint. And what a constraint does is it constrains an object to another object. So supposing Victoria is a soccer player, and we have an animation where this soccer ball is kicked into the scene, and then she receives it on this foot, and then maybe does some trick where the ball stays attached to her foot. In the past, what you'd have to do is you'd have to set up a keyframe at the start where the ball starts from its start position entering the scene. Then you do a keyframe moving it over to her foot, maybe a second or two later. But then it would become complicated, because now what you need to do, as her leg moves around, you need to keyframe all of the transition points to keep the ball attached to her foot, which can be a real pain. An alternative might be to bring the ball, to have a ball that comes in where you keyframe from here to here, and then you change the visibility and you have a second dummy ball which is parented to her foot, and you switch the visibility of this ball off and you switch the visibility of this ball on, and then wherever her foot moves, the parented ball moves, much as this sword moved with her hand. I hope I'm making sense. But what a constraint group does is, I'll just briefly set one up. I'll move this over to her foot. Oh no, I'll leave this out here. and I'll do add constraint. And now what I do is I constrain it to her leg. So I'm just going to open this group, and I'm going to go down to her foot, hopefully, if I can find it. Right, left foot. Where's left foot gone? Left foot here. So I've constrained this to her left foot, so the ball should jump to her left foot. Okay. And now what I get is a new option on ball called constrain 1. So at 1, it's fully constrained to the foot, and at 2, it's fully unconstrained. So what I could do is I could animate this constraint parameter. So the ball kicks in, so I do my keyframe here at the start of the movement, my keyframe here at the end of the movement. So that's just a normal keyframe animation of a linear animation from here to here. We'll get into animation in a future video, but for now it's just a way of explaining the child-parent relationship. So what we do is we leave the constraint at 0. We do a keyframe at the start here, a keyframe at the end here, and then once we get to this point, we would set the constraint level to 1, and now it's fully constrained to this foot. So wherever this foot now moves in subsequent animations, the ball would also move with it. And I talked about having multiple parents in the earlier parenting when we were talking about the room. This is a situation where you can have multiple parents, essentially multiple constraints. What you could do is you could then have you could constrain that object to multiple figures, and what happens is then you would have multiple constraints down here for the sphere or the soccer ball, if you want to use your imagination. And by having lesser degrees of constraint, the ball's position can move relative to more than one figure, which can be complicated, but if the easiest way to imagine it is if you had one constraint parent here, one constraint parent here, if you set them both to 50%, it would move to halfway between the two of them. Okay, I will one day do a tutorial for that probably, but for now I'll just leave it at that. The reason I didn't is because I didn't want to mess about with the animation of figures. But hopefully that answers some questions and gives you some ideas on parenting that perhaps you weren't aware of. There is one final parenting thing. I'm just going to get rid of that constraint group by undoing. There is one final thing that I think I just touched upon, and that's when you can't parent. So remember, if I drag this here, if I drag it to the universe, that's basically the same as DAZ Studio's unparent option or parent none option. So that basically says it has no parent. But there are times if I try and drag an object and it won't parent to an object, and I don't actually know why that is. It just here, see, this won't go blue. It won't let me parent to the root object here. What I have to do is I just have to open up one level, and I can parent this to the body instead, just in case you're wondering why that doesn't do that. Okay, I think that's everything covered. Hope you found that interesting, and I will speak to you next time, guys.